Hi again, everyone. Today's material deals with the Classic era, period of time from about 1750 up until the early decades of the 19th century, 1800 to 1820 or so. Time periods begin to overlap a little bit between composers who are traditionalists as opposed to people who are innovators, as you'll see coming forward. I want to take a few minutes to reinforce the information in text chapter 11 and hopefully make it easier for you to make good sense of what you're hearing, both in the text assignment music and in the non-text assignment music. Now, you'll remember that I've spoken about the interrelationship between social practices and the arts. This continues, it's going on nowadays, but definitely continues, friends. We go from the Baroque era into the Classical era. Scientific and industrial revolutions, great advances in both of these areas, lead to the rise of the middle class. This is significant because they become a source of patronage, a market force in music. The Age of Enlightenment also has an effect on this because people begin thinking more for themselves rather than relying so much on the dictates of the church. Church and state become more and more separated. This is the time period during which our founding fathers wrote our basic documents, the ones that our culture has been running on for the last 240 years or so. These are the various components of the Age of Enlightenment. They were a contributing factor in revolutions in both our country and a little bit later in France. The effects that it has on music are listed here. Since we have a new group of listeners, middle-class people are significantly well-off financially that they can patronize the arts. They like music that's a little simpler than things like the Bach Richerchar or maybe the Hallelujah Chorus that you've listened to recently. So the music becomes a little more simplified. And you can see that there's more keyboard music, more vocal chamber music. People want to make music at home. They've got the means to hire teachers for their children or for themselves and to buy instruments to do that with. There's a transitional pair of styles, the galant and sentimental styles, that are sort of a bridge between the Baroque and the Classic era. The text will speak about them briefly. Now, in terms of what happens in music in relation to our basic elements, more blended ensembles. What that means is we start seeing more ensembles with different families of instruments together. The orchestra becomes larger, more winds, brass, and percussion are added to the string section. Melody dominates the texture, which means we go from some of the polyphonic music we've been hearing to more homophonic music, melody with accompaniment. The harmony remains simple. There are more modulations or changes of key in the music. Rhythm is very steady almost all the time. Rubato, flexible tempo, you'll remember that's what that means, is used in cadenzas, and I will speak about a cadenza in a few minutes. Forms actually become a little more complex, and we're going to spend a good deal of time working with that, particularly sonata form. Ooh, there we go. Much more instrumental music. Public concerts become much more popular as there is now a much wider audience for these things. Written music replaces the shorthand music that was used for the basso continuo. You'll remember the harpsichord and cello combination. And the piano replaces the harpsichord. This is significant because you'll remember that the piano can change volume. It can make crescendos and decrescendos, which the harpsichord cannot do. So this has a profound effect on music in which keyboard instruments are involved as we get into the Romantic era. The city of Mannheim in Germany does some combinations of instrument families. The performances of these large ensembles, which is actually the very beginnings of what we would call a modern orchestra, they adapted pieces that had been written earlier, dance suites from both the Renaissance and the Baroque, and overtures to operas, and presented them in concert form. Their performances lead to the development of music being written specifically for the orchestra, for this larger mixed ensemble. And the symphony, which is a four-movement work most of the time, not always, but almost always, four movements written for symphony orchestra. Symphony literally means sounding, phony, together. String quartet, you've seen one playing the Pachelbel canon, two violins, one viola, and one cello, becomes a common chamber music genre. Chamber music is just music meant to be played by small groups in an intimate setting. Opera continues to develop, and the significant change in opera is that following social trends, instead of operas about mythological figures from Greece and Rome, historical figures, it moves more towards the characters in the opera presentations become contemporary. And there's a lot of political humor, contemporary comedy in classical opera. Some prominent composers, you'll be reading about them in the text. Franz Joseph Haydn is an earlier classical composer, very important composer. You're going to be listening to some of his music and writing about it in the non-text assignment. His working situation, he worked as a servant, a very highly placed servant, but a servant nonetheless, for Prince Esterhazy for a very long period of time. The fact that he had steady employment and was very talented allowed him to write a huge amount of music, and he was very much involved in the development of the symphony and the string quartet, both of these genres. The prince had many get-togethers with royalty from other countries, so by the time Haydn left his service, you'll see that Haydn lived quite a long time, he was well known all around Europe in aristocratic circles. And the last 2 or 3 decades of his life, he was a celebrity composer all around Europe. He's important for the development of the sonata allegro form as well, which we're going to be working with today. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, you've heard his piano variations already. The text will talk about him. I'm not going to read this off for you. You can check that on your own. And Ludwig van Beethoven, a later classical era composer and a very pivotal figure. He is a composer whose rejection of norms, he refused to write things just the same way everybody else did. He was a free thinker, an innovator, and some of the innovations that he brought to music, the way that he worked with the various elements, lead music from the classical era into the Romantic era that you'll be reading about and studying over the next couple of weeks in class. This, I spoke briefly about sonata form and Haydn's work in developing it. You will find an outline like this in chapter 11 as well. It is basically an A, B, A, or what's called a ternary or 3-part form. There are themes. In the basic sonata form, 2 themes. In the development, the composer will work with those themes the way that you'll remember Beethoven does in the beginning of his 6th Symphony, which you've listened to already. That is a sonata form movement. So the cool thing about sonata form is that it allows composers to write more extended pieces of music by having a basic form, ABA, but sub-elements of that form underneath. So, just a quick look through today's class notes regarding new terms, the galant style, which I mentioned, transitional between the Baroque and classical styles. Crescendo, diminuendo, or decrescendo are changes in volume. Chamber music becomes much more common during this time period, especially string quartets. Cadenza, you'll be listening to a cadenza in today's non-text assignment. It was originally improvised. Most players now, most soloists will play a written out cadenza. Usually the soloist will play alone, and you will hear this at the end, usually of the first movement of a concerto. Remember that a concerto is a piece for solo performer and orchestral accompaniment, usually in 3 movements. Spoken about sonata form, minuet and trio, another simple form from the Baroque, from an earlier time period. An overture, is something that was originally written to introduce a stage presentation, an opera or an oratorio or a ballet. Nowadays we have overtures from Broadway shows, that kind of thing. It's become a genre in itself. Some composers write overtures that aren't connected to anything, but they write in that form. Definition of symphony. I've spoken a little bit about the Age of Enlightenment. Definition of classical. Virtuoso, we've already spoken about that a little bit. And the ritornello, this is a term that's left over from the Vivaldi piece that you have already listened to. So I just wanted you to have that to look at. This week's assignment, textbook chapter 11, the homework that goes with it, the usual 1 week time frame for that. The listening example, NT 11, there's just one thing for you to listen to and write about. This is it. The first movement of a concerto for trumpet and orchestra by Haydn. You can see that he wrote it late in his life. Alison Balsam is the soloist. It's in sonata form. Here's some information about the piece and about sonata form as well. What I would like you to do with this assignment is I want you to write significantly more than you have been doing in these assignments. I mentioned that in today's introductory notes. This will be a good intermediate step for you in developing what you can do in terms of describing music in a more long form. In other words, a little more preparation for writing reports. This concerto movement is not very long by concerto standards, only about 7 minutes in length. So listening to it 2 or 3 times, as you have been doing, taking some notes, fleshing them out into a more substantial description of what you're hearing is what I'd like you to do. You will see on the introductory notes that I've shown you exactly where in the movement the various portions begin, the development, the exposition, then the development, the recapitulation, and the cadenza at the end. And I hope you enjoy Alison Balsam's trumpet playing. She's a real virtuosic performer. So enjoy the music, and I'll speak again very soon.